In this video, we connect two powerful stories. First, the United Kingdom in spring 2020 spectrum auctions, mass deployments, lockdown, and the April death curve peak. Then, the United States Verizon and AT&T's fragmented mmWave rollouts, state-by-state lockdowns, and the April surge followed by later waves. Side by side, these sections reveal the same pattern: infrastructure expansion colliding with pandemic crisis, shaping public perception and protest across both nations. Watch closely as the dual narratives converge into one truth. United Kingdom, dual narrative, corona discharge, and clustered tower effects. Spring 2020 in the United Kingdom carried two powerful currents at once. Telecom operators were pressing ahead with spectrum processes and mass deployments across London, Birmingham, and Manchester. The country entered national lockdown on the 23rd of March, and the death curve peaked in April. This overlap did not occur in a vacuum. Public protests against mast sightings surged during lockdown, the timing stoking suspicion and anger. The core of the story is an overlay: infrastructure rollout, pandemic policy, mortality peak, and a physical phenomenon little discussed in public: corona discharge, whose behavior is sharpened by bad weather and by dense equipment clustering. Corona discharge, name the source. The source is the electric field around high-voltage conductors and sharp, geometric points that become strong enough to ionize nearby air. When the local electric field exceeds air's breakdown threshold, electrons cascade, forming a plasma sheath at edges, points, and wet or contaminated surfaces. This is not a lightning strike. It is a continuous or intermittent ionization at the boundary layer of hardware. It is most intense at sharp edges, protrusions, cable terminations, connector pins, lightning arresters, and small radii on metal fittings. It is also seen at vegetation points, leaf tips, thorn edges, and water droplets when fields are strong. Practical sources include high-voltage transmission lines, substation bus bars, insulators and their metal caps, rooftop installations with exposed conductors, aviation obstruction lights with wiring discontinuities, and any tower components where geometry or contamination concentrates field strength. That is the source electric field, plus geometry ionizing air into a chemically reactive plasma halo. Weather sharpens it. Rain, fog, mist, and wet snow lower the effective breakdown voltage of air, because moisture droplets and surface films promote electron emission, distort local fields, and provide conductive paths. In rain, water films and droplets form on insulators and metalwork, increasing irregularities and enhancing discharge. In fog and mist, dense aerosols create a rich medium for ion chemistry and glow, increasing ozone and nitrogen oxide formation in the boundary layer. In wet snow, crystal edges and melt films provide sharp points and short-lived conductive bridges that can wake intermittent discharge. Thunderstorms add ambient field and charge, while wind drives droplets and contamination onto hardware, sustaining the effect. The rule is simple: more moisture, more surface irregularity, more discharge at lower applied voltage. Trees in the field. Trees are not passive backdrops. Leaf tips, hairs, and thorns are natural field concentrators. In thunderstorm conditions or near strong man-made fields, corona discharges can form at leaf edges, producing ozone and reactive oxygen species, and catalyzing emissions of plant volatiles. Under persistent wet conditions near hardware, leaves can show stress, cuticular damage from reactive chemistry, stomatal dysregulation, or edge browning where discharge has been recurrent. Branches and canopies close to energized fittings are more exposed, especially where pruning creates fresh, sharp edges. In urban corridors that combine traffic pollution, wet microclimates, and dense towers, the chemical cocktail changes further. Plant tissues face both reactive gases and particulate deposition. The observable signs are subtle but cumulative: leaf edge damage, altered phenology in sensitive species, and micropatches of stressed vegetation downwind of hardware clusters. Animals in the field. Corona discharge produces sound, a high-frequency hiss or crackle, reactive gases, notably ozone and nitrogen oxides, and brief local electric field fluctuations that can startle or stress wildlife. In bad weather, when discharge intensifies, the hiss is more persistent and the chemistry is stronger. Birds roosting on or near structures, small mammals living in verge habitats, and livestock under or adjacent to line corridors can experience respiratory irritation from ozone avoidance. Behavior due to sound and smell, and stress responses tied to unpredictable field changes. The evidence is often local and qualitative changes in roosting patterns. Restless livestock under certain wet conditions, and wildlife steering clear of buzzing equipment, but it aligns with known animal sensitivities to air chemistry and acoustic disturbance. Multiply this by clusters, overlapping sound fields, stacked chemical microplumes, and recurring stimuli across small areas. People in the field. For humans, the pathway is largely environmental. Corona discharge in wet weather adds reactive gases to the immediate air, especially ozone, which is a respiratory irritant, even at low concentrations for sensitive individuals. The acoustic signature hissing, crackling, can be an irritant or stressor, particularly at night or in quiet lockdown streets. People report headaches, throat or eye irritation, and sleep disruption around noisy or odorous hardware in damp conditions. These experiences fit what corona discharge produces and how weather amplifies it. None of this implies causation with pandemic mortality, and we do not make that claim. It does show that clustered, active hardware in wet UK spring weather can alter local air and soundscapes precisely when people were confined, anxious and hyper-attentive to their surroundings. Clustered towers, small areas, compounded effects. When operators site many towers and rooftops within tight urban grids, multiple phenomena stack. Each site has edges, connectors, and insulators that can discharge in wet weather. Each produces its own acoustic and chemical footprint, and the microplumes and sound fields overlap. Add to this aviation lighting circuits, feeder lines, and adjacent power infrastructure, and you create a patchwork of ionization sources. In a dry summer, these effects recede. In a rainy March-April, they sharpen. People do not see ionization, but they see new hardware, hear unfamiliar hissing, and smell sharp ozone on damp nights. Protests during lockdown were not solely about radio frequency exposure. They were also a reaction to the tangible changes in environment under stress. When sites are clustered, the cumulative burden is higher. More discharge events, more maintenance burns at connectors, more nighttime noise, more local chemistry. United Kingdom timeline and overlay. Early 2020 carried forward telecom momentum from prior years. Operators pushing coverage in London, Birmingham, Manchester, the dense hubs with priority demand, while spectrum processes set the frame for expansion. As March approached, line crews and contractors were visible. Then the lockdown hit on the 23rd of March. Work continued in many places, and people at home noticed it more. In April, the death curve peaked. At the same time, UK spring weather delivered rain, fog, and mist across urban belts. Corona discharge is wetter weather dependent. The timing added to public unease. News and social media circulated reports of mass protests and vandalism. Whether every report cited correct technical reasons is beside the point. The lived experience was a convergence of infrastructure change, wet weather discharge signatures, and pandemic anxiety. Bad weather specifics matter. Rain forms films on insulators and connectors. These films become temporary conductors, sharpening local fields and making corona more likely. Fog and mist pack the air with aerosols that participate in ion chemistry, increasing ozone formation in the boundary layer. With still air, patches can linger. Wet snow creates alternating films and sharp crystal points that switch discharge on and off, accompanied by characteristic crackle. Even drizzle changes behavior, because persistent light moisture sustains surface irregularities longer than heavy downpours that wash them clean. UK cities, with their mix of pollution particles, grime on fittings, and frequent damp, are primed for discharge in March-April. Maintenance reduces at clean surfaces and smooth. Radii help, but new installations, rushed timelines, and exposure to the elements can leave vulnerabilities. What corona discharge is not. It is not proof that towers cause illness. It is not an invisible force that explains a pandemic. It is a real electrical and chemical phenomenon that can degrade local air quality, produce noise, and stress nearby biological systems, especially under wet conditions and in clusters. Keeping the narrative disciplined avoids overreach while honoring what people felt and observed. The dual narrative becomes a triple overlay: infrastructure rollout, pandemic policy, and wet weather corona discharge, changing the local environment at the same moment. Location facts and urban texture. London's rooftop landscape dense, varied hardware. Exposure to maritime air yields, frequent wet weather discharge opportunities. Birmingham's mixed industrial belts and transport corridors add pollution particles that interact with discharge chemistry. Manchester's damp climate and close-packed urban canyons shape sound and air movement, making small plumes noticeable on still nights. In all three, hardware clustering is the multiplier. During lockdown, quiet streets made acoustic signatures more salient. People at home encountered smells and sounds they might have missed in ordinary bustle. Protests and public response. Many protested mast siting during lockdown on practical and symbolic grounds. Visible industrial change during a health crisis, and the sense of being acted upon without consent. Corona discharge does not headline a placard, but its signatures hiss, odor, irritation are felt realities, especially in bad weather. When clustered towers make these signatures persistent, the threshold for protest lowers. The narrative tension is not merely scientific. It is civic trust, timing, transparency, and environmental stewardship under stress. Technical mitigations. Evidence-aligned, non-speculative. Smooth hardware geometry and larger radii reduce field concentration and discharge. Clean, dry insulators perform better. Contamination and moisture are risk factors. Weather shields, robust sealing of connectors, and regular maintenance lower incidence. Spacing and siting choices matter. Reducing tight clusters in sensitive microenvironments eases cumulative burden. None of these measures erase ionization under all conditions, but they demonstrate that discharge is real, predictable, and manageable. Truth and precedent. The United Kingdom's spring 2020 story is not singular. It is an overlay of timelines and mechanics, spectrum processes, and urban mass deployments. National lockdown beginning the 23rd of March and the April death curve peak. And wet weather corona discharge, changing local air and soundscapes exactly when people were most confined and alert. Trees act as participants, not scenery. Animals react to sound and chemistry. People feel irritation and stress. Cluster many towers in small areas, and the environmental signatures stack. Keep the claims clean. Document timing, weather, siting density, and observed effects. Avoid conflating correlation with causation, but refuse to ignore physical phenomena that make the environment harder to bear. For public teaching, the frame is simple and strong. Name the source: electric field at sharp geometry ionizing air. Name the amplifiers: rain, fog, mist, wet snow, contamination. Name the domains affected: trees, animals, people. Name the multiplier: clusters in small areas. Tie it to the UK's 2020 timeline and urban hubs: London, Birmingham, Manchester. Acknowledge protests under lockdown and hold the line on disciplined truth, This is not a side page. This is the main narrative, continuous, copyable, and fit for precedent. Wake TF up. United States, fragmented rollout, patchwork lockdowns, and the parallel narrative of uneven impact. The United States entered 2019 to 2020 with a technology story that was already fragmented. Next-generation telecom launches that favored dense urban cores and high-value districts. Verizon and AT&T pushed mmWave deployments into select blocks of major cities, beginning in 2019 and expanding through early 2020. This technology delivered headline speeds, but required dense small cell siting, line of sight, and clean geometry constraints that naturally produce islands of coverage rather than broad national networks. By design, access was selective. Downtown streets, stadiums, airports, and business corridors saw new nodes and rooftop equipment. Suburbs and rural areas did not. In parallel, the pandemic struck. Beginning in March 2020, governors issued lockdown orders at different times and with different scopes. California moved first on the 19th of March. New York followed on the 22nd of March. Illinois on the 21st of March. Other states delayed, implemented partial measures, or rejected statewide closures. The result was a mosaic of restrictions layered on top of a mosaic of infrastructure. Fragmentation was not only visible, it became the defining texture of public life. The April 2020 death surge etched itself into the American memory. New York City became the epicenter, with hospitals overwhelmed and daily mortality peaking across the state and region. New Jersey, Massachusetts, and parts of the Northeast recorded heavy losses in that first wave. Later waves hit differently. Summer surges across the Sun Belt, then larger winter waves that touched most states, but with intensity that varied by region, policy, and population density. The death curve overlay, therefore, maps to the patchwork of restrictions and the geography of early mmWave deployments. Urban centers bore the brunt early, while later waves reflected broader spread and mixed policy responses. None of this implies causation between telecom rollout and pandemic outcomes. It does reveal the pattern: fragmented infrastructure, fragmented policy, fragmented mortality moving in parallel within a single national story. Verizon's outward-facing narrative in 2019 centered on commercial launches in cities like Chicago and Minneapolis, later expanding to Denver and Providence, then adding New York, Los Angeles, Houston, Dallas, and more in 2020. AT&T followed a similar trajectory, choosing urban testbeds and business districts in cities such as Indianapolis, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, Atlanta, and Austin. The technical truth is plain. mmWave signals are short-range and highly directional. They struggle with obstructions, and they perform best with dense siting and clear air. That makes fragmented coverage a structural reality in early phases. People walking a few blocks inside a core might see blazing speeds, then step into a shadow and lose the experience entirely. This visible unevenness, small cells perched on poles, nodes along certain corridors, gave the rollout a patchwork texture that anyone in those cities could feel. The pandemic policy texture mirrored this. Governors issued stay-at-home orders based on local caseloads, hospital capacity, political judgment, and community pressure. Some states closed schools and non-essential businesses and restricted movement. Others left decisions to counties or advised rather than ordered. Timelines differed. Enforcement differed. Public messaging differed. In New York, restriction was sharp and early because the crisis was acute. In Florida and Texas, measures varied by region and evolved with subsequent waves. In the Mountain West, rural counties often saw limited early spread and lighter measures. America's federal structure ensured that no single experience defined the nation. Instead, county borders and state lines mattered. That made neighbors live different realities at the same time. Public perception formed at the intersection of these realities. Urban residents saw both new equipment and strict lockdowns. Downtown workers experienced early mmWave pilots in the same streets where life suddenly stopped. Essential workers passed small cells while commuting on empty roads. People confined to apartments saw rooftop changes in pole, mounted nodes and silence, amplifying the visibility of deployment. Meanwhile, suburban and rural residents often saw neither no small cells, less stringent restrictions, fewer early deaths leading to divergent narratives about what was happening and why. Fragmentation produced a divide in lived experience, feeding distrust and competing explanations. The overlay timeline is instructive from end to end. Through 2019, telecoms marketed mmWave as the future of speed, but only in selected cores. Early 2020 extended that pattern, adding more cities, but still in narrow footprints. March 2020 began the patchwork lockdowns. The dates mattered, and so did the thresholds each state used to define essential activity, travel allowances, and business closures. April 2020 brought the death surge in New York and the Northeast. Later spikes appeared in June-August across the South and West, and the winter wave intensified spread nationally with uneven peaks. Throughout, mmWave remained an urban fragment. Expansions continued, but the presence never generalized across the country the way mid-band or low-band spectrum can. The technologies tell their own story. As surgical, mid-band is broad, low-band is expansive. The pandemic echoed that urban shock first, broader spread later, with irregular intensities. Cities embody the texture. New York's dense canyons create strict line-of-sight constraints for mmWave, forcing tight sighting and producing visible nodes along select corridors. Los Angeles mixes broad boulevards and varied microclimates, making coverage block-specific while policy responses varied by county. Chicago's downtown launched early pilots with clear street-level visibility. Houston and Dallas combined stadium-centric deployments with business district corridors. In each, the technical constraints of wave short range, sensitivity to obstructions, reliance on small cells, made the infrastructure tangible and selective. That visibility mattered when lockdowns emptied streets. The equipment stood out because people's attention shifted. The absence of bustle sharpened perception of what was new. The pattern in mortality maps onto policy and population density. Early April's surge in the Northeast reflects high density, transit reliance, multi-unit living, and initial importation chains linked to travel. Summer's Sun Belt waves reflect reopening schedules, indoor exposure with air conditioning, and different social patterns. Winter reflects colder weather driving indoor gathering, holiday movement, and fatigue with restrictions. But the peaks still differ among states, tied to the patchwork responses and demographics. Technology and pandemic outcomes are separate domains, yet their maps share a visual trait: uneven clusters and corridors of intensity rather than uniform fields. The lesson is structural. Fragmentation is baked into how the United States builds and governs. Telecom rollouts follow demand, right-of-way access, municipal permitting, and technical constraints, yielding islands of coverage. Pandemic policy follows state authority, local conditions, and political calculus, yielding islands of restriction. Epidemiology follows human patterns and built environments, yielding islands of transmission and mortality. A single national narrative cannot be smooth when the underlying systems are fractured by design. The parallel narrative of patchwork restrictions and patchwork deployments is not a coincidence. It is the mirror of American federalism and market-driven infrastructure. Public response tracked that mirror. In hard-hit urban centers, the simultaneous experience of lockdown, visible equipment, and mortality created fertile ground for fear and speculation. In less affected regions, the absence of visible crisis bred different skepticism. Across the country, the selective nature of mmWave here, one block, not the next made the rollout, feel like an experiment rather than a universal upgrade. Parallel selective lockdowns made the rules feel like an experiment rather than a uniform emergency. Those feelings fueled protests, compliance fatigue, and inconsistent trust in institutions. Narrative coherence faltered because lived experience diverged. Technical clarity cuts through confusion. mmWave is a high-frequency technology with large bandwidth and very short range. It needs dense small cell deployment, line of sight, careful geometry, and clean environments. It does not blanket cities overnight. It stitches corridors of coverage block by block. It is not inherently harmful because of frequency. It is limited by physics and environment. Pandemic policy is a function of decentralized authority and local conditions. It does not blanket the nation uniformly. It stitches orders and advisories, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Mortality reflects exposure, healthcare capacity, and social behavior. It does not blanket the nation uniformly. It spikes where those factors converge. The pattern is the point. For artifact-grade teaching, keep the overlay disciplined. Lay out the mmWave timeline, 2019 pilots and city launches, 2020 expansions into more downtowns, stadiums, and airports. Lay out the lockdown timeline, March 2020 start with state variability, April surge, later waves. Lay out the map of intensity without overreach. Urban shock first, patchwork spread later. Tie these to the lived environment. Visible nodes in rooftop equipment in cores. Enforceable orders in those same cores. Divergent experiences elsewhere. Do not conflate. Do not dilute. Show how fragmentation itself creates parallel narratives that move together without implying causation. The United States in 2019 to 2020 is therefore a clear study in pattern recognition. Fragmented rollout made technology uneven and tangible. Patchwork lockdowns made policy uneven and tangible. The death curve overlay made impact uneven and tangible. People experienced selective technology, selective restriction, and selective suffering. That is the truth of the pattern. Unevenness is the constant. Documenting this with clean timelines and grounded technical context builds precedent without sensationalism. Wake TF up. Sovereign Signal is the channel. Help spread the word. Give us a like, subscribe, and share. If you valued the truth in this video, press the notifications bell so you never miss another fact-filled broadcast. Together, we keep the ledger pure, and together, we break the theater of control.